Europe's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, both claimed that a deal on Britain's departure from the EU could be within sight. Within minutes, sterling climbed more than a cent against the dollar. But elsewhere, the Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington warned in a speech in France that it was either the Prime Minister's Chequers proposal or no deal. Let's go live now to our political editor, Gary Gibbon in Westminster. Gary, what did Michel Barnier say that caused such a reaction?
Michel Barnier said that the deal that the EU was going to offer to Britain was unprecedented. It was of a kind that had never been offered to a third country before. Cue a note by an analyst that whizzes around the city, reaction piled upon that. The fact is, though, that Michel Barnier has said this before, quite a few times, and he added quite a lot of caveats when he finished saying this. I think this is a sign of the sort of period that we are now entering into. There are going to be sudden spikes, there are going to be probably quite a few dips as well, as words come out of negotiations, out of parties involved in the negotiations, and people try to hurriedly interpret, is it new, is it loaded with meaning? I think on this occasion it was probably a misinterpretation, but we are going to see a lot more of these spikes and troughs, I suspect.
And he's not the only person who's been opining on Brexit today, is he?
No. Dominic Raab, the new Brexit Secretary, was giving evidence to a Lords committee on Brexit. And amongst other things, he said that if there was to be no deal, a breakdown in the negotiations, the money that Britain has committed to paying in honour of its commitments as a member of the EU, 39 billion is the British calculation of that fee. Europeans think it could end up quite a bit more than that. He said that money will not necessarily flow to Europe in the amounts that they expect or at the speed that they expect. We haven't had an official reaction from Brussels about that. I think they'll regard it as sabre-rattling and not be that amused. I should tell you, there was a National Audit Office report not so long ago saying that it would be a contravention of Britain's international obligations if they did anything like that. The other person who was speaking was the man who is technically Theresa May's deputy, David Lidington. He was speaking to French business people, and he said it's the Chequers deal, the one announced, the Chequers approach that was announced by the government just before the summer recess, or no deal. I have to say, I haven't found a minister who thinks that argument actually washes. I think people know there's going to be compromise. What you're hearing is harder line rhetoric from ministers who know they are getting closer to the end game in these negotiations, and they know Theresa May lost 2 Brexit ministers and she has to prove that she argued tough when she was at the table.
Gary, thanks very much. Krish.
Well, Theresa May has promised to help Nigeria combat terror attacks by the extremist Boko Haram group, announcing a new security partnership to give the country's armed forces more specialist equipment and training. The announcement comes despite concerns about human rights abuses by Nigerian forces. Our political correspondent Michael Crick is travelling with the Prime Minister.
Dressed in a Nigerian designer jacket she'd acquired specially for today, Theresa May was greeted by dancers and a guard of honour as she arrived in the capital, Abuja. This visit to one of Britain's biggest former colonies isn't just about trade and the world after Brexit, but helping counter the threat from Islamic fundamentalism and the conflict that's seen the death of 20,000 people, 2 million made homeless, and caused many Nigerians to flee to Europe. Mrs May has come to Nigeria today partly to sign a new partnership between the two governments over defence and security. That, despite the fact that human rights organisations are continuing to make serious allegations of abuses and violations by the Nigerian regime.
Welcome, Madam Prime Minister.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you.
Chief of Staff.
Very good to meet you.
When Mrs May met President Buhari, the leaders agreed that Britain would boost its help to the Nigerian military forces in both equipment and training. For the first time, Britain will train whole units of soldiers, not just individuals. But the Nigerian army, it seems, have been as big a threat to some citizens here as the fundamentalists. 3 months ago, Amnesty International produced a report on thousands of women who'd supposedly been rescued by the Nigerian army in the war against the jihadist group Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria. According to Amnesty, these women were kept in camps. Many of them, hundreds, possibly thousands, were raped or starved to death. And yet today, as she's had the red carpet treatment, Theresa May has signed a deal for Britain to give yet more training to Nigerian soldiers. But today's deal does include new diplomatic channels for Britain now to raise human rights problems that might occur in the Nigerian army.
I think it's important that we in Nigeria have shared security threats that we need to cooperate on and working against, be that issues like Boko Haram or indeed human trafficking. But we recognise the issue of human rights. I have raised that today with the President here in Nigeria. He has set up a committee of inquiry to look into these issues, and I welcome that.
But will such measures be enough, though, to prevent future human rights abuses by Nigerian troops? And would Britain withdraw its support if they happened again? Well, earlier Mrs May was in the Nigerian capital, Abuja. This evening she's been here in Lagos, the most populous city in the whole of the African continent. And continuing the human rights theme, Mrs May, as Home Secretary and as Prime Minister, has always been interested in the problems of modern slavery and human trafficking. And tonight she visited a project here in Lagos run by the Salvation Army but funded by the British government to try and prevent future human trafficking and deal with the victims of human trafficking. And this evening she met a couple of those victims, Nigerians who'd returned here from Libya. Now, back in 1960, Harold Macmillan, one of her predecessors, spent a month touring Africa, 10 countries in a month, and made the famous Winds of Change speech. Theresa May is here for just 3 days, about to return to her plane behind me, here for just 3 days, and in a few minutes we'll be flying across the continent to East Africa and spending the day tomorrow in Kenya.
Michael, thanks very much. Well, as Michael mentioned there, Theresa May has used her visit to Nigeria to promise tougher action on trafficking and modern slavery. Yet under the UK's hostile environment policy on immigration, just 12% of trafficking victims get leave to remain. And Labour said Mrs May's promise rang hollow, claiming government cuts to border staff had only made their work more difficult. Simeon Brown reports.
We are protecting the identity of this woman. She says her life is still in danger.
I first came to the country with the help of somebody in the village who told me to come to the UK to further my education. They didn't do what they promised. I was trafficked.
And what kind of things did they do to you?
I was sold to men old enough to be my guardian or my father.
Debbie, not her real name, is from Nigeria. The country is the 5th largest country of origin for victims of modern slavery in Britain. She was placed in a house run by a woman she had to refer to as Mummy. How did you escape?
With the help of the friend of the lady I was living with, she told me to run away. It was really hard for me. When living in the house, I was not able to go out by myself. So when I ran out, I was lost. I was on the street for 3 days.
Debbie is now one of the thousands of trafficked victims currently calling the UK home. But what happens to victims like Debbie when they manage to escape their captors? When just over 1 in 10 of all the victims of modern slavery were granted a discretionary leave to remain. That was in 2015.
Of course, these people haven't chosen to come here. They've been brought here, usually by coercion or deception, but they're still treated in exactly the same way. They're falling into the hostile environment head first, and of course that's again because of their vulnerability. They're having to find ways to survive. That can often put them back in the hands of traffickers.
The Home Office told Channel 4 News it would not be appropriate to provide an automatic entitlement to leave to remain, but that each case must be considered on its merits, and only exceptional or compelling reasons will trigger the granting of leave to remain. Why can't you go back to Nigeria?
I can't go back to Nigeria because I was living with my grandma, and when she passed away, that's when the lady brought me to this country.
The Home Office at the moment do not have an automatic policy of granting right to remain to victims of trafficking, and they believe that if they did, then it might congest the system with bogus claims and undermine the kind of public trust in our system. What's your response to that?
I think it's not fair on people. Going through trafficking and being a refugee is not good for people. It's adding to the problem, because I was there once.
Today, the Prime Minister continues her tour abroad. Debbie's story is a reminder of the many victims of trafficking in need of protection at home.
Now, West Midlands Police have offered a £5,000 reward in the hunt for their main suspect in the double killing of